All right. Hey, everybody. We are going to be focusing on what happened after the Cold War ended. We'll be focusing on the Americas. We'll be spending quite a bit of time talking about changes in Latin America. We will look at new developments and revolutions in the Middle East as well as Africa. We'll spend a bit of time talking about China and new reforms, some good and some not so good, as well as changes in Eastern Europe because the Cold War is ending and the Berlin Wall is coming down. The success of the Cuban Revolution energized the revolutionary left throughout Latin America, and it also led to the United States organizing its political and military allies in Latin America in a struggle to defeat communism. In Brazil, a coup in 1964 brought in a military government whose combination of dictatorship, use of death squads to eliminate opposition, and the use of tax and tariff policies to encourage industrialization through import substitution came to be known as the Brazilian solution. In Chile, 1973, military officers overthrew President Allende. How they did this was by using elements of the Brazilian solution. These elements were applied in Chile by the government of Augusto Pinochet, whose US assisted coup overthrew the socialist Allende government in 1973, and in Argentina by a military regime that seized power in 1976. Despite reversals in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, revolutionary movements persisted elsewhere. Nicaragua was typical of Central America in the 1980s, in which the U.S. backed a military force that agreed to fight communists. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista movement overthrew the government of Anastasio Somoza and ruled until it was defeated in free elections in 1990. In El Salvador, the Farabundo Martin National Liberation Front, FMLN, fought a guerrilla war against the military regime until declining popular support in the 1990s led the rebels to negotiate an end to the armed conflict and transform themselves into a political party. By 2000, many changes will be happening. The military dictatorships that were established in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina all came to an end between 1983 and 1990. And all three regimes were brought down by their own excesses and by popular desires for a return to constitutional government. The right-wing authoritarian governments in Guatemala also used violence, claiming it was necessary to fight communism. The US will have gained more influence in Latin America by 2000, and this was seen in US use of military force to intervene in Grenada in 1983 and in Panama in 1989. After the end of the Cold War, there was a shift towards democracy in Latin America. The US was able to influence Latin American nations to reduce state involvement in the economy, called neoliberalism in Latin America. The result of fewer government protections for local industries was economic stress in some regions, such as in Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez was elected president in 1998 and began rolling back the neoliberal reforms. Both Brazil and Argentina followed in electing left of center presidents as well. Enduring challenges will continue in the Middle East, and strategic importance of the Middle East grew because of the primary source of fossil fuels. There was internal tension between Arabs and Israelis, and that would intensify in 1973. Arab representatives created the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. There's also the Iranian Revolution of 1978, and Islamist movements changed the dynamics of the Middle East and its impact on world affairs in the 1980s. Crises in Iran and Afghanistan threatened to involve the superpowers. The US reacted to these crises with restraint, but the Soviet Union took a bolder and ultimately disastrous course. In Iran, American backing and the corruption and inefficiency of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's regime stimulated popular resentment. In 1979, street demonstrations and strikes would topple the Shah. The Shah would flee to the U.S., but before that, U.S. money and support kept the Shah of Iran in power. And the Shah used oil money to modernize Iran. In 1979, he would flee to the US, and a new ruler would rise, Ruhollah Khomeini, who lived from 1902 to 1989. And when the Shah flees in 1979, Khomeini returns from his exile in Paris, and a referendum adopted a new constitution. The overthrow of an ally and the establishment of an anti-Western conservative Islamic Republic in Iran were blows to American prestige, but the US was unable to do anything about it. Iranian nationalism increased after the 1980 invasion of the country by Iraq. In the fall of 1980, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded Iran to topple the Islamic Republic. The US covertly supported Iran at first, but then in 1986 tilted support towards Iraq. In the 1990s, Iran faced serious economic problems. With a stalemate in his war with Iran, Hussein decided to invade neighboring Kuwait in 1990. The Persian Gulf War in 1991 began with devastating bombings of Baghdad and liberation of Kuwait. Iraq invaded Kuwait in an attempt to gain control of the oil fields. Saudi Arabia felt threatened by Iraq's actions and helped to draw the U.S. into a war in which American forces led a coalition that drove Iraq out of Kuwait, but left Saddam Hussein in power. The Persian Gulf War imposed conditions on Iraq that kept tensions high and helped lead to a new war in 2003. The Soviet Union faced a more serious problem when it sent its army into Afghanistan in 1978 to support a newly established communist regime against a hodgepodge of local, religiously inspired guerrilla bands that controlled much of the countryside. The Soviet Union's struggle against the American-backed guerrillas was so costly and caused so much domestic discontent that the Soviet leaders withdrew their troops in 1989 and left the rebel groups to fight with each other for control of Afghanistan. The Taliban, an Orthodox Islamic group, emerged from this conflict to take power in 1996. After the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan and the country was taken over by Taliban Islamists, more fighting would continue. Keep in mind, the Taliban had been armed by the US and they were trained by the CIA. In fighting the Soviets, the Mujahideen had sent out a call for Muslims from around the world to join them, and Osama bin Laden led an Islamic revolutionary group called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda used terrorism against the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, as well as an attack on American soil in New York City and in Washington, D.C. on September 11, 2001. Israel kept land on the West Bank of the Jordan River and in Gaza, acquired from the Six-Day War in 1967. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, organized Palestinian resistance under Yasser Arafat. In 1987, the PLO declared an intifada, or a ceaseless struggle, against Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank. In 1993, Israeli and Palestinian diplomats met in Oslo and agreed to a roadmap for peace. In 2000, U.S. President Bill Clinton organized another meeting between Arafat and Ehud Barak, then Prime Minister of Israel. And that would be Clinton's final act before switching, and President Bush would take over. And even after Clinton steps down, he does still retain quite a bit of influence. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Japan and Korea. After World War II, Japan renounced militarism and agreed to a democratic constitution written by the Americans. Now, unfortunately, there really was not a whole lot of options for Japan. The first major area of Japanese success was in automobile exports. And today, Japan is one of the most successful countries when it comes to building automobiles. A number of very popular cars come from Japan. So you've got Honda, Toyota, Nissan, Lexus. Actually, Toyota and Lexus are owned by the same company. That's not the point, though. But thinking about the number of Americans who choose to drive foreign cars, specifically cars from Japan. But anyway, moving on. The Japanese economy grew at a faster rate than that of any major developed country in the 1970s and 80s. The average Japanese family income outstripped that of the US by the end of the 1980s. This economic growth was associated with an industrial economy in which there was an alliance of firms receiving government assistance in the form of tariffs and import regulations that inhibited foreign competition. By the end of the 1990s, however, the Japanese economy had stagnated and was in crisis. As such, close relations between business and government ultimately proved to be a liability. The Japanese model of close cooperation between government and industry was imitated by a number of small Asian states, most notably the Republic of Korea, known as South Korea, in which 4 giant corporations led the way in developing heavy industries and consumer industries. Hong Kong and Singapore, which were former British colonies, also developed modern industrial and commercial economies. All of these new industrialized economies shared certain characteristics: discipline and hardworking labor forces, investment in education, high rates of personal savings, export strategies, and government sponsorship and protection. South Korea became economically competitive with Japan. By the 1980s, the nations of South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and later Taiwan would be called the 4 Asian Tigers or the 4 Asian Dragons. Bad loans, weak banks, and the effects of international currency speculation caused the Asian financial crisis beginning in 1997, but the situation stabilized somewhat through the efforts of the US and Japan, and organizations such as the International Monetary Fund. And if anybody here is interested in economics, you will actually study the Asian financial crisis beginning in 97, because that eventually has a dramatic impact on the US housing market and the US housing market crisis that occurred. We can talk more about that later if you guys want. In China, after Mao's death, the regime of Deng Xiaoping carried out successful economic reforms that allowed private enterprise and foreign investment to exist alongside the inefficient state-owned enterprises. At the same time, the command economy remained in place, and China resisted any type of political reform. Deng Xiaoping directed China to a new economic path. He focused on market incentives, and as the Chinese economy boomed, there was a dramatic increase in urban development. Hong Kong was returned to Chinese control in 1997. If you guys remember, China lost control of Hong Kong to the British because of the Opium Wars. In 1989, student protests in China began, and one of the most famous protests was the Tiananmen Square massacre that occurred in 1989. And that's the image that you see. That is Tank Man. And just to let you guys know, the tanks did stop. However, after this photo was taken, Tank Man was ushered away and nobody ever saw him again. So you can speculate on what that means. As China's economy grew, so did the divide between the wealthy and the poor. Globally, economies in the 1990s shifted from industry to marketing, financial services, and telecommunications. By 2010, China had become the world's second largest economy, surpassing Japan. All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about the end of what's called the end of the bipolar war, the crisis in the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was premier of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982, and the Helsinki Accords in 1975 represented a high point. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union had an increasingly inefficient economy, and the Soviets overextended themselves militarily with their involvement in Afghanistan. From the mid to late 1970s, the U.S. seemed on the verge of losing its status as a world power. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won the presidency by promising to restore American power, confidence, and international reputation. Reagan was particularly anti-Soviet, and called the Soviet Union an evil empire. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the Soviet Union's economy was strained by the attempt to match massive US spending on military weapons, as well as a space-based missile protection system. The Soviet Union's obsolete industrial plants, inefficient planned economy, a declining standard of living, and the incredibly unpopular war with Afghanistan fueled an underground current of protest. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new premier, and Gorbachev introduced two major policies of reform: perestroika and glasnost. The Soviet people were not satisfied with these reforms. Conservative members of the Communist Party attempted a coup against Gorbachev in 1991. That same year, hardline communists led the coup to retake control of the Soviet Union. Massive changes would continue to occur. Boris Yeltsin, 1931 to 2007, is when he lived, became president of the new Russian Federation. He led tanks to Moscow to oppose the coup. Yeltsin was advised by U.S. economics to rapidly convert Russia to a capitalist free market system. In Chechnya, a Muslim separatist group demanded independence. And in 1999, Yeltsin resigned and was replaced by Vladimir Putin, a former intelligence officer of the KGB. Central Asian republics of the former Soviet Union had trouble transitioning to democracy. The unification of Germany was difficult to achieve because of the disparity in wealth between the eastern and western halves. The Helsinki Final Act was an agreement signed by 35 nations that concluded the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was obviously held in Helsinki, Finland. The multifaceted act addressed a range of prominent global issues, and in doing so had a far-reaching effect on the Cold War and US-Soviet relations. So we're going to talk about the Berlin Wall, Berlin Wall, there we go, a bit more, as well as the fact that you have West Berlin and East Berlin. You have the French, British, and American sectors, as well as the sector that the Soviet Union has control over. But now let's talk about the collapse of the Soviet bloc. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was losing control of the Eastern Bloc. Poland continued to resent the state's policy of atheism. Because don't forget, Poland is a very Catholic country. Poland continued to fight back. In 1980, the Solidarity Trade Union was created. In Czechoslovakia, the fall of communism was appeased peacefully through the Velvet Revolution. The collapse of communism in Romania was achieved through a very violent overthrow. And in 1990, East Germany agreed to open the gates to West Germany. Events in Eastern Europe were very important in forcing change in the Soviet Union. The activities of the Solidarity Labor Union in Poland, the emerging alliances between nationalist and religious opponents of the communist regimes, and the economic weakness of the communist states themselves led to the fall of communist governments across Eastern Europe beginning in 1989 and to the reunification of Germany in 1990. The weakness of the central government and the rise of nationalism led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in September of 1991. The dissolution of the Soviet Union is not only the reformation of Russia as a country, but it's also the formation of new nations. We'll talk about that as well. Ethnic and religious divisions led to the dismemberment of Yugoslavia. Predominantly Roman Catholic, Slovenia and Croatia became independent states in 1992. Bosnia, a more ethnically mixed region, declared independence in 1992 as well. And this was followed by a period of the new term used called ethnic cleansing. And ethnic cleansing by Orthodox Serbs who attempted to rid Bosnia of Muslims. The U.S. intervened in 1995, ending the fighting. But new fights broke out in 1999 in the southern region of Kosovo. The US, Britain, and France joined in an aerial war against Serbia, who thought of Kosovo as their ancient homeland, to remove Serbian forces from the region. And I want to talk more about what happens during this period. So, more specifically, in April of 92, the government of the Yugoslav Republic of Bosnia Herzegovina declared its independence. And over the next several years, Bosnian Serb forces, with the backing of the Serb dominated Yugoslav army, targeted both Bosniak, which are Bosnian Muslims, and Croatian civilians. And this resulted in the deaths of about 100,000 people. 80% of these 100,000 were Bosniaks, and quite a high number of them were men and boys. And by 1995, 100,000 people, so in less than 3 years. It was the worst act of genocide since the Nazi regime's destruction of the European Jews during World War II. In the 1980s, Western Europe sought a greater level of cooperation. The Treaty on European Union was signed in 1992 in Holland. All of Europe prospered under the Union, but the most successful were the agricultural countries, specifically Ireland, Spain, Greece, and Portugal. Some European leaders feared that the European Union would become too much like the United States. Beginning in 2000, the European Union began to negotiate to allow former Soviet satellites to join the European Union. We're going to stop there for today. Email me if you have any questions, and have a great night, guys. Cheers.